So I wonder where we plug the scanner in on this thing here. 1959 Oldsmobile Dynamic 88. It's here for a couple of things. Transmission fluid is leaking. So I had a quick look underneath here. Took this inspection plate off. And it's leaking from the front pump housing, front seal on the transmission, so the transmission has to come out. God knows if we can find even parts for this thing anymore. 60 years old. I noticed a couple other things here. I noticed this control arm is appeared to be loose here, and so I tried tightening the bolts, and the bolts are just spinning, so the control arm is basically falling off. The suspension sits really low. This tire is dragging like crazy. I don't know if the brakes are dragging, why it's dragging. This side here, it turns free. Aside from that, the problem with the ignition is the ignition switch doesn't stay in its on position, kind of like the newer GMs had, where the ignition would just shut off. So, and nevertheless, it needs an ignition switch to fix the starting problem. And I'm not sure what's going on with the fuel gauge. Here's the fuel gauge sender wire here. Comes through the floor, goes to the top of the tank. I can check it inside the trunk and see if there's a problem with the wire in the trunk. Here's some backup light wires. You know, you can tell this was an afterthought. The backup light switch is a unique concept on this thing. It's I don't know if you're going to be able to see it up there, but it's a mercury switch on the gear shift lever, so that when the gear shift is actually down, because reverse is where typically low would be in most vehicles today, that mercury switch turns on the backup lights. Oh, this is not good, this tranny leak. Transmission has to come out. That could end up being a nasty repair. I remember doing those frost plugs. Is there one behind the starter here? Yeah. Yeah, behind the oil filter housing, yeah. They were rotted through. Lots of grease fittings that didn't get greased on the last grease job. There's like 12 grease fittings on the control arms alone. You know, inner ball joints, upper and lower. This thing had a tremendous number of grease fittings. That bushing looks like it's, or that stabilizer link looks like it's ready to fail. Oh well, we'll make some calls. So I noticed the right front wheel dragging like crazy, so I pulled it off, and the wheel cylinder is seized on this side, so this brake is not applying. That would make it pull theoretically to the left, because the left wheel is probably working. You're going to have to measure the wheel cylinder bore. And of course, to get the wheel cylinder off, you have to take the brake hose off and the brake line off, so that could migrate into other things. But it is what it is. Well, around 45 years ago, I salvaged these from the dealership. They were throwing them out when I was a service manager, shop foreman there. And they're wheel cylinder cups from the 50s and 60s, so I believe those are 1 1/8, which is this size here, so hopefully we can remove that backing plate and rebuild that wheel cylinder. So there are 4 bolts that hold the backing plate on, so you have to unbolt the backing plate, because these 2 bolts would be right here on the steering knuckle, so you can't take the wheel cylinder off without removing the backing plate. The brake hose is threaded into the wheel cylinder, so it needs to be removed, and it's attached up here. The line's still in pretty decent shape. It's covered in so much oil and grease. So we're going to remove the wheel cylinder hose and the wheel cylinder from the backing plate. If it wasn't for these brackets here, I'd be able to just do it right on the backing plate, but unfortunately those brackets prevent the pistons from coming out if you were to step on the brakes with the shoes or with the drums off, and that prevents the pistons from coming out in order to do this without removing the wheel cylinder. Okay, so here's the two ears I was talking about on this brake bracket that when the wheel cylinder's in there prevent the pistons from coming out all the way if you were to accidentally step on the brake. There's the wheel cylinder. It's pretty corroded. Hopefully we can get the pistons out. They should come right straight through actually. There should be a spring and two cups and two spreader washers inside. Well, we'll get it apart and have a look. These dust boots are a little bit cracked, but they're just dust boots, so they should be good enough to reuse. Hopefully we have the right size seals. So these pistons are oxidized in here pretty good. I've managed to push both of them in about 1/4 of an inch. They should come straight through, but in between them, like I said, there is a separator and a spring, so I'm just compressing the spring. I'm going to try putting it in a press and pressing it through with a socket or something of the right size. So there's the piston, there's the cup seal, there's the spring, the spreaders. I used this socket to push it through, so we're going to hone this cylinder out, and hopefully there's no serious corrosion in there that doesn't come out with the hone, and we'll put new seals in, clean it all up. So the cup seals in this one are 1 1/8. I hope that video is taking it. They're actually written right on the inside. I've honed the inside of the cylinder out with a little hone here, and there's pitting in the middle, but that doesn't really matter because the seals don't go in that far. That's in between the two where the spring is here, and the rest of the cylinder looks pretty good. So we're going to put new seals. I've cleaned the pistons up, put some brake fluid in it. I'm going to wash up this piece and put it back together again. So the rear cylinder is reinstalled, brake hose is reinstalled. Talk about over-engineering. They got castellated nuts holding the backing plate and steering knuckle on, or the steering arm on the steering knuckle. So they're all back together, castellated nuts and cotter pins. So put the brakes back together and put the wheel back on. So there's the brake shoes reinstalled, primary and secondary shoe. These brake systems in the day had no self-adjusters, so here's the adjuster star wheel down here, which I've taken apart and freed up. It wasn't really bad anyways, and it needs to be manually adjusted every so often, as do all of the brakes on this car, I believe. One other weird thing about this, or in the day, if you notice on the wheel nuts on the left hand side, you'll see an L, and that indicates the wheel nuts are left hand thread on the left hand side of the vehicle. So you have to tighten them to remove them. In other words, they're opposite. Engineers thought the rotating of the tire would tend to tighten the nut if they used a left-hand threaded nut on that side. At least that's the story I was told. So there's the single circuit master cylinder. No power brakes. One circuit. Blow a line. You are panicking but not stopping. That was pretty simple system, not very reliable either. Like I said, one circuit, so you had no backup plan. That's why they used to call it an emergency brake. So I was going to look at the wiring in the trunk for the fuel gauge because he says it's not working, and I see something has taken up residence back here. The vehicle's obviously been left sitting for a while, but this is how the fuel gauge sender wire comes through the floor of the trunk with a grommet. There's the tail light wires there. That's the way things were built back then, and they got away with that. Wow, that's pretty crude. Well, anyways, we're going to test the sender resistance here. I think back in 2012 when I went through this car before, after 22 years, I had to make a fuel tank sending unit as well as repair the fuel tank. But anyways, we'll carry on. Well, the fuel gauge reads just above empty according to the ohm meter measuring it at the sender wire in the trunk. the resistance was about 2.5 ohms, which would indicate that it's empty, or the wire above the tank is squashed. So I lowered the top of the tank slightly so I could inspect the wire, and the wire is fine. I can make this gauge go to full by putting a 45 ohm resistor in the circuit. So I suspect the sender has failed or is shorted, or the float fell off. That's a possibility. If I remember correctly, I had to make a sending unit that would function, because obviously no parts available. Now the other problem I had last night when I went to bring it in was the car wouldn't stay running. It would start and stall, start and stall, start and stall, reminiscent of the days when the ballast resistor had failed on the Chrysler. But what I noticed is this ignition key won't stay on. So I'm going to start it. But the key is just barely, like, it doesn't want to stay, and it seems like when it gets hot, it's worse. Yeah, see, there it is right now. See, the oil pressure light is off. Now it's on, now it's off, now it's on, now it's off. I'm just releasing the key, and so the key won't stay in the run position. If I hold it there, it's fine. So, it's funny how 55 years later, GM has the same problem with the ignition key turning off on its own, and they get sued over it. But this one is just wore out, you can see. Put a weight on it. Well, I'm going to check eBay for ignition lock cylinder. So there's the ignition switch assembly, so it's serviced as an assembly. You probably can take the tumblers out. To get this off, I used a pair of snap ring pliers to turn it, and then it just pulls out from behind the dash, and the connector comes apart. Now, what I noticed is somebody's been here before, and they've had this switch apart, and it was partially apart, so I'm going to see if I can take it apart again and maybe fix it. So I managed to push it back together again and restake it, bend the little white metal / aluminum tabs across, and it seems a lot tighter now. This switch had actually come apart and was near falling off, but now it seems pretty solid when I turn the key. Yeah, it's much better now, much more positive. So we're going to put it back together again. Well, now it seems to be nice and secure now. Yeah, it's a nice solid D10 now. Seems to run fine. This has got a cold light, as well as a hot light, an oil light, and a gen light.